assignment, quite honestly, I was bewildered. How was I going to find connections? Steve's book was about Senator Truman in the months preceding and during World War II. Not to mention that David McCullough wrote an extensive book on Truman, and I wondered what was left to say. Not to worry. Plenty. Mary's book was on Cold War spies, with the added caveat of a connection to the Kennedy assassination. Reading both these wonderful books, there are connections. This is not the stuff we learned in history. And neither author planned to write a book, but the books were born after 10 years of research and documentation. And with that, we begin our adventure. Mary, you're a filmmaker. How did you transition from making a film to writing a book? Start from the beginning, Mercury 13.
Well, I made that transition kicking and screaming. It was not my plan. I set out to, in a movie form, as in a feature film, you go to the movies, buy a ticket, see an actress portray. I thought we were going to be talking about Jerry Cobb, the first female astronaut trainee at NASA in 1960 who passed the same test as the men and then was unable to become an astronaut because she was a woman and she fought for her rights. I think we can all agree that'd be a fantastic film and it would have been a great career move for me. I sought Jerry out. I worked with her for 2 years. We had her under contract. We were ready to go until I was visited in my office by a federal agent who warned me that something was wrong with the film. I was pretty scared, looked into it, and I discovered a doppelganger. I simply Googled Jerry's name and I found a doppelganger similar to her. And at that point I just went on a wild chase to figure out what was going on, who was I really dealing with, why was her doppelganger at the National Archives with 10,000 documents in the Kennedy saga. Suffice to say, I went on a long, down the rabbit hole adventure for many years, and I realized it could only be a book. It really, you can't debut sensational material like this in a film. It must be chronicled, footnoted, and done academically, so I kind of had to quickly try to learn that new craft, and that's how I landed in it.
Steve, you started by writing an essay. When did you realize you had a book in you?
Yeah, it's funny, Mary and I have been talking, we realized we must have walked by each other in the halls or the desks at the National Archives over the last few years because we both spent a lot of time there. But for me, this began about 10 years ago. I'm originally from Michigan. Any folks from Michigan here? Yeah, go blue. I was writing an article, I was asked to write a magazine article for a Detroit magazine about Detroit's contributions to World War II, which many of you know are significant. The construction of an incredible amount of tanks and airplanes and rifles and all kinds of material and trucks that played a giant role in winning in the war. In the process of that, I was researching a huge bomber plant that Henry Ford built outside Detroit. It's called Willow Run. And by the end of the war, they could make a 4-engine bomber in this plant every 63 minutes. Which at that time, and you can imagine, and everyone knew at the time, this was more planes coming out of this factory than the Japanese or the Germans could make in a year. And it's one of those production miracles that helped win the war. But early on in 1942 and 1943, when my grandfather worked there, the factory wasn't working. It was slow to get up for a run. The press was beginning to call it Will It Run? And anyway, I started researching this magazine article and I ran across something called the Truman Committee coming to investigate this factory and find out what was going on. Basically finding out all the money that the US government was throwing at the Ford Motor Company to build this plant, whether it was being wasted or not. And that led me down a very long and fun internet rabbit hole to find out what the Truman Committee was. I ended up reading the oral history accounts of many of the young lawyers hired to work on this committee. Many of them in their first jobs out of college, and suddenly they find themselves in the halls of the US Capitol talking with the captains of industry and the heads of the military and going undercover in factories and shipyards around the country. It was the most dramatic and exciting times of their lives. And I'm a reporter, and at a certain point in doing this research, I kind of started to feel like, wow, I think there's a story here. And as Ellen notes, I've read David McCullough's giant book, and I've now read it 3 times. It's a wonderful book, but it barely skips over this chapter, this 3-year period in Harry Truman's life. And I started looking around and realized there only had been one book written about the Truman Committee, and that was in the 60s by a scholarly academic professor. It's a fine book, but its goal was not to tell a story, which is what I do for a living, but to analyze whether congressional investigations work. So here we are several years later, and a book that I hope some of you will enjoy or find a good story in there.
Mary, you spent many, many days and hours with Jerry Cobb. Who is the woman you know?
Well, I'd love to say I answered that question in the book, and you know, I'm not sure that I did, because I really think she was an enigma and a phantom by design. I do believe that Jerry was an intelligence agent, and my book lays out the case that she borrowed the identity of a woman named June Cobb, that there was a very complicated overlap for espionage purposes. These things are very hard to unearth because, you know, the CIA and other agencies that use covers, they're not in the habit of, like, you know, calling Steve up here and doing a little NPR story on it, right? It's not something you can look up or easily find, even in other books or even in other movies. And I thought what I was finding about her double identity was really amazing. So I think I uncovered, somewhere in the book I say that Jerry Cobb was like, you really can't look directly at her. The light bends around her. And you must trace, like a black hole, the arc of that light to figure out where she really is and what she really did. The New York Times reviewed my book, and I love the headline. They gave me a mixed review. Overall, I'd say positive, but I loved their headline, where they called her the super spy. The filmmaker and the super spy was a headline they threw out there. And I think that was really accurate, because what I feel that I unearthed about Jerry was that she was indeed just that.
How did you get her to tell the story?
Well, the key to getting her to tell a story, as with anything with Jerry, is not to get her, not ask, or not really directly pry, probe, or you know, go directly after anything. I was initially there to tell her official story, the NASA story. I mean, I was there to chronicle that in a film in a very formal way. She basically selected me after I approached her to do just that, but she was hiding all these secrets. When that derailed, we moved together. I just said, it can't be a film. She didn't admit to having the double identity, by the way. She never directly admitted. She just loved the fact that I'd found the double identity. And then we decided, I said, I can't do the film. She said, fine, let's just get to know each other better. Interesting to have that right on the heels of confronting somebody about not being who they say they are. And then she asked you to travel the world with her to all the destinations where June Cobb did her spying. We went to those together, hand in hand, to take a look, and she showed me around. That's how I got to know Jerry Cobb, but not by asking, because in those instances where she wanted to take cruises, she was elderly, very older, had trouble getting around. Cruises were easier for her by that point. But if I were to ask her a direct question, that was a way. I'll never forget one direct question I asked. We thought it was innocuous. We're sitting here having a nice, glass of wine in the cruise, and I said, how many, names of celebrities you know? She was back in the day, right? That was really information she would not discuss. And not only did that ruin the evening, it ruined the entire next 2 to 3 weeks of that particular trip to Spain. She refused to talk about anything to me because I'd asked that probing question. So that's how difficult it was to manage discussions with Jerry. Best to just wait for her to throw you a crumb. And that's pretty much what I did.
At what point did you suspect she was a CIA agent?
Well, I knew something could be wrong. How many federal agents do you supposedly meet by happenstance, but then they start dropping you like really weird warnings about your film? And I tried to tell this lady, hey, I'm, legit filmmaker. I've gotten, going to big actresses, I have producers, this is, for real. And I've worked with an Oscar winner before, so I'm not used to a person in the Department of Defense telling me things that are so-called wrong with my film. But she then came to my office and told me directly. She visited my location in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She pointed to my documents about Jerry and said, these are all classified. They need to be in a vault. She said, without detailed looking at them. And I knew something was terribly wrong. And I simply, the moment of discovery was simply Google. I Googled Jerry Cobb and the word CIA, and up came this doppelganger that within an hour, knowing Jerry's biography, I knew the odds of this other woman doing these astronomically impossible things and being all these same places, and the descriptions on and on and on it went. So it only took hours before I knew something was terribly wrong and that Jerry probably had an overlap with this one.
You mentioned classified documents. How did you get them?
Well, they weren't classified. I think that was a way of a warning, because I said to the lady, hey, these are like her own letters and pictures, letters, and things she gave me from her scrapbook, and some of them were published articles, right? So, yeah, a few were medical things from NASA and some were for tests, but most of them, I couldn't think of anything that would be classified in there. And I said so to this agent, at which point the agent just, huffed at me in my own building and said, no, they were classified, unless they're over 50 years old, but maybe not, pretty much they should be in a vault. She's very bossy to me. I like this woman, but she got it a little bit Johnny Law in me in that moment. So I knew something was terribly amiss.
Dee, tell us about the Truman Committee. How it began, who was on it, and how far it went.
Sure. Mary, I was just thinking when you were talking, I say, one thing I know of 30 years as a journalist is people in the government love to tell you you're not supposed to have stuff that you have. And they don't like it when you do have it. It's funny. Yeah, so the Truman Committee. So in 1940, Harry Truman was probably one of the least known politicians in Washington. He had sat in the Senate for 6 years and done pretty much nothing. When people did know of him, they knew of him in a negative way. They thought he had been put into office by the Kansas City machine, by the boss named Tom Pendergast, and so Truman was pretty much of a non-entity in Washington. He narrowly won re-election in 1940 in a re-election campaign that had been opposed by, among others, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. He was not a popular guy, it's safe to say. And so somehow, 4 years later, he finds himself Vice President of the United States, and 90 days after that, he finds himself President of the United States. So there's clearly a story in there somewhere of how this happened, and that's the story that I talk about in The Watchdog. He came back from his re-election victory in November of 1940. He took a couple of weeks off. When he came back to Washington in January that year, he noticed on his desk letters from a lot of his constituents saying, so I should set the moment here, 1940. War has been raging in Europe for more than a year. The Germans had captured by this point, big humps of the European continent. And the United States, at least Franklin Roosevelt and many in the high government, knew that eventually the United States would be sucked into this war. And once again, as pretty much always happens in American history, the United States found itself completely unprepared for war. In 1940, the U.S. Army was ranked in size 17th in the world behind Romania. So once again, here began a giant military buildup to make the country ready for war. We needed millions of soldiers, eventually 12 million men and women in uniform. The Navy needed new battleships. They needed merchant ships. The Army needed trucks, and the airplanes especially there were only a few hundred, and they were mostly obsolete. So a lot of government money was being thrown at this problem very quickly. One of the biggest needs was to build army camps. They needed if we're going to have millions of people in uniform, there needed to be camps to train them and food to feed them and uniforms to clothe them and barracks to house them. And this was happening all over the country. Truman was getting letters from some of his constituents saying, hey, something funny is going on up here in the Ozarks in a place called Fort Leonard Wood. People sitting around doing nothing. The people are getting rich up here. Truman, one of the fun things about Truman is that he did not send his staff or his aides out there to check this out. He did not get on a plane with a congressional delegation and go investigate. Truman walked out of his apartment one day on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., right across the street from where I used to live. And he got in his car and he drove from there to Missouri. And he showed up at this army camp, just a very well-dressed man in a double-breasted suit, and he started asking a lot of questions, and he saw the same things that his letter writers had been telling him. Giant piles of lumber sitting out in the snow going to waste, people sitting around playing cards and earning a paycheck for it, contractors soaking the government for 3 or 4 times they should be making. And from there, Truman kept going. He visited a bunch of other construction sites, and he found the same thing. He came, as I say in the book, he came back to Washington hopping mad. He stood up on the Senate floor on February 10th, and he said, hey, we should have a commission to investigate this. Well, if you think about it, here's a Democratic senator, and a pretty puny one by that standard, at that time, proposing to poke his nose into the business of the administration of his own party and his own president, Franklin Roosevelt. Nobody in Washington thought this was a good idea, especially Franklin Roosevelt. But it quickly became clear that if a Democrat didn't do this investigation, that Republicans were perfectly happy to pick up the baton and take it on. So the Senate leadership tossed him a bone. Truman, here's $15,000. Go have your little investigation. That was barely enough at that time to hire a lawyer and a couple of secretaries. Truman in the next 3 years, took that tiny appropriation and he turned it into the most powerful congressional investigating arm that the country had ever seen, and it's the direct thing that he did in his life that prepared him and led to him becoming president of the United States.
How many people were on this committee?
At its maximum, there was about 15 investigators and about 15 of what were called secretaries at the time. Truman, the way you did those committees at that time was usually you hired a lawyer who was some politician that you owed a favor to, who had just lost election, or you hired a prominent lawyer who would sort of mail this job in while they made money in their private sector. Truman went to the Attorney General of the United States and he said, I want the best prosecutor you've got. The Attorney General, Robert Jackson, thought of a young lawyer, 36 years old, in New York, who had just won a big case putting the head of a utility company in jail for ripping off the American people for about $20 million. His name was Hugh Fulton. He came down to talk to Truman. Neither character liked each other or not. He had never heard of Truman and couldn't find anything out about him. Truman thought this was a very unlikely fellow, but he eventually took the job for $8,000 a year. It was the best decision probably either man made in his life. And then from there, they hired a bunch of young lawyers, most of them right out of college. And this was what really inspired me to tell the story, was reading decades later some of these young lawyers saying suddenly, basically saying, you know, I went in for my job interview, nobody asked me who I voted for, nobody cared what party I worked, I represented. They just wanted me to do a good job. And many of them spent the next 4 years saving the country, essentially probably billions of dollars and who knows how many lives by making sure that the American service people serving overseas had the tanks and the planes and the weapons and the ships that they needed, the best quality at that. And that was basically for these young people a really exciting time in their lives. And they found their leader really inspiring. They found they were working for a guy who wouldn't throw them under the bus or wouldn't leak stuff to the press or wouldn't favor the head of a big corporation over their views. And for me, it was just kind of a bit of an inspiring story, and I really enjoyed telling it.
Tell us some of the stories,
Oh,
the
sure.
outrageous stories of the things that were happening by the big companies and corporations.
Sure. The Army camp investigation was the first they put out, and they basically concluded the government had wasted about $100 million building army camps. Somehow they had built all these army camps 20 years earlier to fight World War I, and I kid you not, the Truman Committee report says the plans had been lost. They found they were building these army camps, what the committee said, along Civil War lines. In other words, there were no concrete roads. They didn't realize that tanks weighed 20 or 30 tons and you were going to have to park them on concrete or they would sink into the ground and be ruined. All kinds of crazy stuff like this going on. One of the major investigations I write about was about a steel plant. On January 16th, 1943, this is how my story begins, a brand new tanker ship. One of the things the United States needed was tanker ships, and shipyards were springing up on the West Coast to build them, and build them fast. A brand new one on January 16th, 1943 was sitting at its mooring in Portland, Oregon, when all of a sudden a sound rang out that was heard over a mile away. The ground shook. The police, the firefighters, the FBI raced to this scene. This was wartime now, expecting sabotage. They quickly learned no. But this giant ship, it was 543 feet long, the SS Schenectady, brand new, had never left dock. It looks like, in the picture you can see in the book, it looks like a giant picked it up and snapped it in two and set it back down in the water, broken in two. What the hell happened? It was a big investigation, all this. They quickly ruled out sabotage. It wasn't that. It wasn't the temperature or the weather or something. Nobody quite knew until 3 months later. An industrialist named Henry Kaiser, who had built the ship, was testifying before the Truman Committee, and they started to ask him about it. What happened to that ship that broke up? Finally, he says, well, our understanding is it was bad steel. Bad steel from the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company in Pittsburgh. Everybody, the conversation kind of moved on, except all these young lawyers sitting there knew that they had been getting letters for months from an inspector at that steel plant saying bad steel was coming out of the door of this place every single day, tons of it. If the steel didn't meet its strength specifications, they would fudge the numbers and just sell it to the government or to the Merchant Marines or to the British Navy anyway. Maybe it was close enough to do good, maybe it wasn't, nobody knew. But Truman Committee had documentation that this plant was shipping bad steel. The man's name was George Dye. He was what we call a whistleblower today. Truman sent 3 investigators up there. They went undercover in the plant. They subpoenaed eventually the documents that, weirdly, the most bizarre thing is, they started to interview the steel plant employees. Well, here's the inspection book. How come some of them are written in pencil? Well, pencil ones mean that we didn't get the exact inspection report, so we would just have to call up the other company that made the steel and find out what the numbers were. Okay, how come some have a capital F written next to it in pencil? This is one of these moments, and Mary, you know this from films, that you just live for when you're a journalist or a storyteller. These 3 steel plant employees look at each other, and finally one of them says, F means fake. F means phone. F means phone. That means we had to phone it in. They all knew that phone doesn't start with an F. And they took the young secretary who had filled in the book, they took her into an office, they shut the door, and one of Truman's assistant chief counsel said, okay, what's the deal here? And she finally fessed up, F means fake. She signed an affidavit on Senate stationery that day that says we are faking the steel numbers. As much as 5% of the steel coming out of this factory was fake. Truman subpoenas the head of the steel company, the head of United States Steel. We want you in Washington on Tuesday. We will have all the reporters there, a big hearing. And this was front page news across the country in March 1943. That same week that Harry Truman was on the cover of Time magazine, suddenly the unknown politician was hailed as a billion-dollar watchdog, was Time's headline. And this is basically, I could tell 10 more stories like this, just amazing stories that you run across of these investigations.
One more, the Higgins. It's my
Oh, the
favorite
Higgins
story.
boat. Yep. So we've all seen the stories of D-Day, and you see the soldiers going ashore on these boats. There are 30 or 40 men in a boat, and they're going to go up to the beach, and the ramp comes down, and they all run off. These boats, I found out during this research, were called Higgins boats. An entrepreneur from New Orleans named Andrew Jackson Higgins designed them, and he had created the best. This was a huge question, by the way, in World War II. How are we going to take thousands of men on a ship at sea and get them onto a beach safely while they're being shot at the whole time? You couldn't just sail into a port because that would be bombed and everything. It was impractical. So it was going to have to be on beaches, whether in Normandy in June 1944 or all across the Pacific Ocean. And no boats existed at that time to do this. Andrew Jackson Higgins had solved this problem. He invented a wonderful, cheap, wooden boat and they were called Higgins boats. However, the Navy had a boat of its own design that it liked much better. Higgins was a bit of a jerk. He was brash, he was loud, he was kind of obnoxious, and the Navy didn't like him. He could not get an appointment. He kept saying to the Navy, my boat's way better, it's way better. Finally, he gave up and he knocked on Harry Truman's door. He went to visit him in his office and said, help me out here. Truman came up with a really good idea, and these were for heavier boats that would take a tank ashore, a 30-ton tank. Truman said to the Navy, take that guy's boat and your boat, let's take them down offshore in choppy waters and let's put a 30-ton tank on them and see what happens. Higgins's boat, they did this down off Norfolk, Virginia. Higgins's boat steamed over, it landed its tank on the beach, and then it went back to circle around the Navy design, which was foundering in the water, and it circled around to see if it could help out. Suddenly the Navy decided that maybe the Higgins boats were the better design. They ordered several hundred of them. Dwight Eisenhower would later say that the Higgins boats were one of the major tools that helped win the war, that helped make the D-Day invasion a success. And without Truman intervening here, he could get nowhere. So anyways, many, many examples of this, and there were fun stories to tell.
Mary, why have we not heard the stories of your Cold War spy?
I'd love to know more about why June Cobb in particular was hidden. Jerry was not hidden. When I approached Jerry Cobb, I mean, there's quite a few. There's a Netflix series called the Mercury 13. Some of you may have seen it. If you haven't, it's interesting, but a lot of it is, I don't want to say it's untrue, because I believe it actually, for the most part, is true, except they're just not telling you the deeper story that in what I believe to be Jerry's case, at least a component of the Mercury 13, it was a cover story for her, at least her participation. And I should say that, as I learned, I didn't really know anything. Maybe being down in DC at NPR, maybe you run into more government officials. I really hadn't. And I didn't really know much about cover stories. I didn't expect people moving in my midst or somebody I was interviewing might have a completely false backstory. She might be, and then I might have purchased that story with some investors to tell a movie about her, right? So it was a mess. But I learned that actually it's not so uncommon to have a cover story. Like, intelligence agents do. It's certainly some undercover, other witness protection people, that are under the witness protection program, which I learned. We all think of that as being very airtight, the witness protection program. But when a CIA agent goes and gets another identity and lives undercover, there, as I learned, and I cite in the book, it's a much more elaborate construction of a false identity. It's much more airtight than would be the witness protection program. Because the person who set up the witness protection program, it learned from the CIA, basically admits this in his book, and he says, we didn't have to do anything like that elaborate thing they have to do to penetrate it. We just did the simple witness protection program version. Okay, paraphrasing there. But, so the true story of this is highly protected. If somebody's walking amongst you with a double identity, that's for national security reasons, presumably to protect them. But I believe that June Cobb, who was a spy, and so this is the doppelganger now, this is who I believe she was. Jerry, I believe, spied as June Cobb. Not only did I do a tremendous amount of research on that, but I actually found a witness who knew June Cobb at the location where June Cobb was reporting, and this person I gave a photo sheet to, and she very clearly looked at the picture, what's supposed to be June Cobb's, that's not her, and looked at the pictures of Jerry and was like, picked that out of the lineup. Actually, I had other women in there. So there she is. Her hair was different, though. I don't quite understand it. She never wore it like that, but yeah, that's June. That was Jerry. So I have, not only do I have what I think is a mountain of information linking them, but I also have an eyewitness, which is very hard to get because most of the people in the era of these Kennedy documents have passed. So you really have to dig deeply to get her. At any rate, so I think I've nailed that Jerry Cobb used that name for espionage. And Jerry was no means walking away from that whole idea when I confronted her. She loved the whole idea, knew a lot about June. That's chapter 1 of the book. But at any rate, I believe that June Cobb, sadly, was overlooked in the Kennedy saga by the researchers. And I hate to say it so bluntly, but I do believe it's because she was a female. Sadly, I'm afraid that the researchers, almost all of whom were guys, who looked at, and they were trying to do due diligence. It's the same reason that a woman on Dealey Plaza called the Babushka Lady was 33 feet away from Kennedy when he was shot in a trench coat and a headscarf and glasses, and she was aiming at him with a camera. That woman walked away from the plaza, and unlike the other witnesses in the vicinity, never interviewed by the FBI, nobody figured out where her footage was, she never came forward. And back in 1963, we weren't very worried about a woman 33 feet away from the president when he was killed in that kind of proximity aiming at him. Nobody cared. So we have to think about that. That's the most sensational moment in my book, which maybe you were going to ask me about. That's the end, because I'm like, Jerry placed herself, and we're jumping around here, but Jerry placed herself at the scene of the Kennedy assassination when I confronted her about being June Cobb. I didn't go into the Kennedy assassination because I wanted to. I went to the Kennedy assassination because June Cobb had 10,000 documents. I'm dealing with a woman who's probably June Cobb, and June Cobb was not brought forward by our government when we investigated. They asked for her. They sought June Cobb. And I show the documents in my book where the CIA said, oh, go look for a June Cobb Sharp in New York, as if she's named Sharp now. No, she was not. How do we look at that as anything but deceptive? So they looked for the wrong person, never brought June forward, and I'm dealing with her. So I felt the responsibility. Then when I confronted her about being June, she kind of denied that lightly, but then she placed herself in a fascinating discussion about the assassination in what sounded to me like a getaway flight that day. She described a desperate flight out of Dallas. This is what sent me on a 10-year journey into the Kennedy assassination, to figure out June Cobb. So I believe truly, it was almost all, if you look into the Kennedy buffs, it's almost all guys from the old days, it really is. And they've done tremendous work, don't get me wrong. But I'm afraid that the very reason I sought Jerry out, because I was really interested in the cool capabilities that women pilots had, and that women had to become an astronaut in 1960. That mindset that drew me to her was also the mindset that allowed me to unlock who she was and what she may have actually been doing. So I think some people came before me were not well suited to that job.
Continue on that. You have Oswald, you have Jerry at the airport, Ruby, what was going on? What do you think was going on?
Well, as I went into it, I unfortunately, and I hate to say it, but I just, June Cobb had a ton of links to Lee Harvey Oswald, and they're detailed in incredible, almost boring minutia in my book, because there's these really cool parts of the book where I'm playing cat and mouse with Jerry, trying to figure her out, and I think those are great reads. Then I had the job of saying, if I want to make some inroads in the Kennedy assassination, if I have anything to offer here as a researcher, I have to help educate myself and then educate the audience about these dense files and how the CIA hides identities. So we had to go into some heavy work there. So yes, June Cobb, as I found out, the doppelganger, had a tremendous amount of overlap with Oswald. Oswald was pen paling to an organization called the Fair Play for Cuba in New York City. Well, June Cobb, they asked her who to put in as the secretary, and they hired June Cobb's best friend. It was almost the person who ran that organization in New York City was taking instructions from June, writing to her under an alias, almost like they were covert pals. And so that was one connection. Here's another connection, knock your socks off. When Lee Harvey Oswald died, he had in his possession somewhere at his house the library book that he did not return. And now we have our pictures on our book, Steve. Well, they don't usually name the translator, but in this case, a communist dictator that June Cobb had been spying on, that was one of her jobs, she translated a book of his, which was really a spy operation, but her picture was put on the back of that book. Didn't look like Jerry, it looks like the other lady that my witness said, that's not June. At any rate, so Lee Harvey Oswald had a picture of so-called June Cobb, in the book that he had. It was the only book that he never returned to the library, was a book that June Cobb was central to publishing, and her photo was on it. So that's one of like 100 links that I got. Jerry Cobb was working at Bell Helicopter in Dallas in 1963. The people at Bell Helicopter housed Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife in their home, the Paynes. So, it goes on. I could just go on and on and on. So it was extraordinarily troubling to me that not only did June Cobb have so many links to Oswald, but Jerry actually had more links. And here's another one that always gets me and upsets me. About a year before the assassination, Jerry was in a parade in Dallas in a convertible that took the same route as the Kennedy fatal convertible. And who was she with sitting in that convertible? Her fellow judges that were judging a beauty pageant, and they were all in Jack Ruby's address book. It could go on and on and on. So needless to say, I went down a heavy rabbit hole of concern. And I confronted Jerry that quite a bit, and her answers were less than satisfying.
I want to talk about the Babushka lady, Lee Harvey Oswald shoots. What goes on then? And Jerry is a marksman.
Well, I have to say right now that I certainly don't have every answer about the Kennedy assassination, nor do I claim to in my book. I do put forward some concerning new pieces of information, and I think one of the most sensational, but also truly the most important. I take blowback for this occasionally. A lot of people have been fascinated, though, that I've pointed out the Babushka woman. Now, how I got to this was that Jerry told me the story of trying to get the heck out of Dallas in a plane right after the assassination, but how she couldn't get out of there, and she wanted to get out, but she had to wait for something. Then she heard the president died while she was out in the tarmac, and she's trying to get out of Dallas just to, and the emotion with which she told me that story, and it was so visceral. It gives me emotion to talk about that conversation. So I knew that was true. But the part of her story that couldn't possibly be true was the part where she told me she had journalists, Steve, in the plane, from Life magazine with cameras, and that they all didn't go in to cover the event that day for some inexplicable reason, which made no sense. So I, of course, didn't believe that part of the story, so I did go looking for Jerry in Dealey Plaza on the images. And, I found what I found. I didn't find first anybody. Then all of a sudden, as I'm just winding down my research, as I got right to the fatal area and the visuals right at the fatal shot, there's a woman with, looks like a blonde ponytail, similar to Jerry's, similar frame, similar everything. The woman has a big camera, like Jerry described that they had, and she's aiming at the president 33 feet away, about as far as from here to maybe that, a little farther than that silver pillar from me, maybe one of those cases. And she's aiming at the president with a large camera. And here's the other interesting thing about the Babushka lady. Motorcade's coming this way. Now I'm into my area of expertise. I'm a filmmaker and I spend a lot of time dissecting the imagery and the videos and the films. Okay, I have them all on my computer and I put some online for you to look at. Up comes this motorcade. Now, you always film this way. It's Kennedy and Jackie, they're coming towards you. There's your shot. So what does the babushka lady do? Here's her beautiful shot that she's waiting for. She's standing behind somebody. She turns and she points towards like that pillar, okay? Then, as the motorcade comes into her view, right when Kennedy gets into her viewpoint, his head explodes at that moment, and the fatal shot hits. I mean, I looked at that and I'm like, how did, with all these crazy theories, the grassy knoll we've all heard about, there's theories about manhole covers in the Dowtex building, where's your extra shooter? I'm not saying for sure the babushka is a shooter. What I'm telling you for sure is no woman should walk away from a scene of that crime, 33 feet away, aiming at the president, never to be questioned by the authorities, her identity to go into a mystery hole that we have no idea who she is, nor does her footage come forward. So I'm just pointing out that there was a horrendous hole in that part of the analysis, and even all the researchers speculating haven't come up with her. I'm like, wow, there's another omission where a woman was overlooked. So at the very least, I feel that the babushka should definitely be researched. And yes, I wouldn't have looked for her if I weren't looking for Jerry on the plaza, and that deeply, deeply, deeply troubled me, and I confronted Jerry about that, and I've written about that confrontation and what she said to me, which was by no means assuring at the end of the book.
Steve? Should or
Yeah, how am I going to top that?
I think you can. Could or should there be a Truman Committee today?
It's funny, Senator Bernie Sanders wrote an op-ed in the Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, and it talked about the Defense Department wasting money. And the headline in the Atlantic was, should there be another Truman Committee? Nancy Pelosi went on the Colbert Report in 2018 after the Congress passed a $1.5 trillion economic bailout bill. And the first thing Stephen Colbert said to her was, tell me about the Truman Committee. And everyone in the room probably has seen these stories coming out of the Pentagon of $80 toilet seats or $75 wrenches or whatever. Wherever you're going to have giant government expenditures done quickly, there's going to be a chance for people to get rich off of it. And not necessarily, even in the Truman Committee times, it wasn't just corruption. There's also waste and mismanagement, and just incompetence also came in time and time again. And it's sort of the big three: waste, fraud, and mismanagement. Also, many of the, and so there are frequently calls for a new Truman Committee, and one of the reasons we harken back to the Truman Committee is this committee and Senator Truman and Hugh Fulton as chief counsel kind of laid down the DNA for how these congressional investigations should be done. They kind of avoided press sensationalism, and as a result got lots of press. They established some ground rules for how to do these committees. There wasn't really a gotcha type thing. People would be subpoenaed well in advance. They would be let know that they were going to have to testify before the committee. They would give a chance to make an opening statement, and they would be allowed to read that into the record. This was brand new at the time. So many of the press accounts of the Truman Committee at the time talked about how it was sort of a new, fresh way of doing these investigations. And many of the congressional investigations that have come since, the Kefauver hearings in the early 1950s, Watergate in the early 1970s, all the way through to our current times, use many of the same models for these congressional investigations that were laid down by Senator Harry Truman in the 1940s, and it's sort of this notion of a bipartisan, fact-based investigation is still something, especially in these times, that we really would aspire to. It's really frustrating in the sort of toxic atmosphere of Washington, D.C. that I work in today. It was a really pleasurable thing to spend a lot of time over the last few years in the 1940s instead of the 2020s. And so, yeah, I think we do need one.
And when government worked.
When government worked, yeah. It was really, I mean, that was the best thing about this story is you have all of these young people decades later being interviewed and they're saying, gosh, nobody cared who we voted for, there was no attempt to spin. And don't get me wrong, Truman, especially as an older person, as many of us, his stories kind of got better with time, I'll say kindly. He loved to talk about how the Truman Committee was non-political. We all know that's not true. Truman was an elected politician. The United States Senate is nothing but a political body. And there were a few examples of the Truman Committee having to cut corners for political reasons, but by and large, I say this all the time, it began with 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the committee. Later it was 7 and 4. During Truman's time as chairman of the Truman Committee, they put out 32 reports. Every single one of them was bipartisan and unanimous in the decision. There were no dissenting voices. That is something that I think is a pretty remarkable record, and it was, late in life, the thing that Truman said he was most proud of in the committee's work, and I think we could all sort of yearn for a little bit of that spirit today.
Mary, at the time of the assassination, there was a feeling that Kennedy was soft on communism, including Jerry.
I think I have some overlap here with Steve, finally, some common ground in our.
We found it.
Well, Jerry told me directly in one of our travels that she really felt that America had lost its guts today. We weren't willing to do what needed to be done. And guess who came up? Your guy,
Ah,
Truman. Or specifically, should I say, the bomb. And that's the kind of action that, she felt couldn't be done again. And she didn't think that was a good thing. I didn't tend to argue with her in these kind of conversations. I thought it wise and I occasionally did push back a bit, but I was mostly there to hear truly where she was at. Truman did perhaps what many feel still today needed to be done, perhaps, and many would argue the opposite. But in fact, Jerry believed that America had lost its edge just because there wasn't that bravery to cross the red lines, to go into those areas policy-wise and in other ways. And she didn't think, her assessment was that our populace wouldn't tolerate it. It was actually you all that are the problem, according to her, that the American people, and me too, probably wouldn't go on board for some of the things that she felt were necessary to keep the country safe.
Including an assassination.
She never spoke directly about, it was the don't ask, don't tell on certain topics. So we didn't get to specifically talk about foreign assassination. I'm sure about Castro. Well, actually, I would say there was one that came up. Che Guevara passed in Bolivia, and she was thrilled that he was a goner. So, yeah, I can say that, we didn't sit and hash out a heavy conversation on that direct topic. I mean, Castro, she was no fan of, and of course, June Cobb was after his scalp. So, I knew where she stood without her having to exactly spell those things out to me.
You did tons of research that's documented, but what couldn't you get your hands on?
Wow. Confession. She really never came clean to me about, and whatever that would mean, I'm not saying that it's for sure, but it was very, very clear that her story to me, what she was doing in Dallas that day, had major holes, and she knew it, and I knew it, and I did confront her about that in the end. And I was hopeful that she would unburden herself, right, to me. She wasn't wired that way. She would unburden herself directly in some way to maybe finally, because I was there more or less at the end of her life. In her, when she was really becoming bedridden, it was about a year before she passed, but really she was retreating to her bed and losing physical and mental capacities at that time. And I really had hoped that I would be like a catcher's mitt there. I was one of her only friends. She was a recluse at the end. And considering what I'm there to do, tell her story, the darker story, and she knew that. So I was just trying to be a catcher's mitt to receive whatever she needed to say. And she didn't avail herself of that. I wish I could have crossed that Rubicon, I guess, but it wasn't to be, and she just wasn't wired that way. So she, in some ways, if everything I believe about her is true, intelligence agency or whatever, in some capacity she would have felt the honor of needing to be true to her oath, at least of secrecy. I'm not saying she was true in so many, many respects of what we believe to be patriotism and honor, because I believe she crossed those lines. But I do not feel that she thought she needed. She did once say to me that, "You know me so well, Mary, the good and the bad," she said. We both knew we meant something serious there. But she never wanted to spell it out, and it was not in her DNA.
Are there files you couldn't get your hands on that you would love to get your hands on?
Well, let's just think about this one. What's the one thing that President Trump and Biden both agree on and acted upon? Okay, we can say that's a zero. There's nothing. Yes, there's something. They both agreed to withhold 3,000 to 4,000 documents about the Kennedy assassination, with President Trump kicking the can. He promised in his tweets he'd put them out. Nope, he didn't. That's the one thing I was hoping he'd do for me. No, he didn't do it. Biden then was going to review everything, and then Biden was the guy who said, you know what? We're not going to kick the can and say in 5 more years, we're going to just say we're never letting these out. And that was the final word on 3,000 to 4,000. You want to guess who's in those files? A number of those files are going to have to do with a certain woman, June Cobb.
And on that, I'm opening it up to questions.
Great moderator.
Sure, right there.
Mary, you must have felt maybe disappointment's the wrong word, but let down or something when she finally died and you had not gotten what you wanted. Was that kind of a defeating moment for you?
Well, it almost brings me to tears to hear you say she passed. Because I got to know her. That I wrote, you notice the title of my book, and you heard me say some fantastical things here about the babushka and some things that I feel I uncovered and her telling me she was there. But my book title is A Woman I Know. And I reached out to her because I admired so much about her piloting and her capabilities, and those things were true. So there were things I admired, there were things I came to really find extremely distasteful about some aspects of her persona. She lacked empathy, for one. But I could feel some tears well up when you said that, because I felt more sad, not that I hadn't gotten anything from her, but just that she did pass. She was a big part of my life, and it's just an odd, I'm investigating her, I'm going into her dark secrets, there's aspects of her that I don't like, but I'm very sorry that she passed.